Michael Harrison stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the Seattle skyline disappear behind sheets of autumn rain. At 52, he had everything a man could want: a successful investment firm he'd built from scratch, a beautiful home in Mercer Island, and a family that was the envy of his social circle. 25 years of marriage to Diana, his college sweetheart, had given him 2 children, James, now a promising junior associate at a prestigious law firm, and Emma, completing her master's degree in psychology at Stanford. The gentle vibration of his phone pulled him from his reverie. A text from Diana: "Don't forget about the Hendersons' anniversary dinner tonight. 7 p.m. sharp." Michael smiled, remembering how Tom and Sarah Henderson had introduced him to Diana at a campus party all those years ago. They'd been more than friends, they were family. Tom was now his firm's biggest client, managing nearly $50 million in investments. As he turned back to his desk, his eye caught a discrepancy in the quarterly report he'd been reviewing. A series of unusual transactions in Tom's portfolio, small enough to fly under the radar, but forming a pattern that made his stomach clench. He'd seen something similar 15 years ago, when a client had tried to use his firm to launder money from illegal real estate deals. "Mr. Harrison?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your daughter Emma is here to see you." Emma's unexpected visit sent a wave of concern through him. She was supposed to be in California, deep in her studies. As she walked in, Michael noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. Something was wrong. "Dad, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's about Mom." Michael gestured to the leather chair across from his desk, his mind racing through possibilities. Diana had seemed fine at breakfast, planning their upcoming anniversary trip to Tuscany. "I found something on Mom's phone when I borrowed it last weekend," Emma continued, pulling out her own phone and opening a series of screenshots. "She's been texting someone, a lot. Someone saved as T." Michael's world tilted slightly as he scrolled through the messages. They started innocently enough, casual conversations about investments and family updates. But as he continued reading, the tone shifted. Personal. Intimate. The last message was from 3 days ago: "Missing you already. These stolen moments aren't enough anymore." "There's more," Emma said softly, pulling up banking records. "I noticed some unusual transfers from your joint account while helping Mom with her charity fundraiser spreadsheets. Large amounts going to an offshore account." The quarterly report on his desk suddenly felt heavier. The irregular transactions in Tom's portfolio, Diana's mysterious texts, the offshore transfers, pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve began falling into place. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I started noticing things during spring break," Emma replied, tears welling in her eyes. "Mom's been different, distracted, secretive. Then last month, I saw her with someone at a cafe in downtown Seattle when she was supposed to be at her book club. They looked close." Michael's phone buzzed again. Another text from Diana: "Wear your blue tie tonight. The one I gave you for Christmas." The one Tom had helped her pick out, she told him proudly. "Dad?" Emma's voice seemed to come from far away. "What are you going to do?" Michael stared at the Seattle rain, now falling in angry sheets against the windows. The perfect life he'd built was beginning to crack, hairline fractures spreading like spider webs across glass. But beneath the shock and pain, another emotion was taking root: determination. He hadn't built his firm by backing down from challenges, and he wouldn't start now. "First," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, "we're going to dinner at the Hendersons tonight. And we're going to smile, and laugh, and celebrate their anniversary." He turned to face his daughter, his jaw set. "And then we're going to figure out exactly what's going on, and who else might be involved." Emma nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. She'd inherited his analytical mind, his attention to detail. "I'll help you, Dad. Whatever you need." As they sat in silence, the rain painting shadows across the office floor, Michael began mentally cataloging every inconsistency he'd noticed over the past year but dismissed. Diana's sudden interest in his firm's operations. Tom's increasingly frequent private meetings with her to discuss investment strategies. The way Sarah Henderson had stopped meeting his eyes at social gatherings. The anniversary dinner tonight would be interesting indeed. Little did Tom and Diana know, but they'd just taught Michael the most valuable lesson of his life: sometimes the perfect life was perfectly crafted fiction. And fiction, like glass, could shatter at any moment. The Hendersons' dining room sparkled with candlelight, crystal glasses catching and fracturing the gentle glow. Michael adjusted his blue tie, Diana's Christmas gift, and watched his wife of 25 years laugh at something Tom Henderson had whispered in her ear. The sound was familiar yet strange, like a beloved song played slightly off-key. Emma sat beside him, pushing her salmon around the plate, her shoulders tense. She'd insisted on staying for dinner despite his suggestion that she could skip it. "You shouldn't have to face this alone, Dad," she'd said, showing a strength that made his chest ache with pride and sorrow. "Remember when we all went sailing last summer?" Sarah Henderson's voice cut through his thoughts. She hadn't touched her wine all evening, her fingers fidgeting with the stem of her glass. Diana and Tom were so natural at the helm while Michael and I were completely lost. "Some people just have a natural chemistry," Diana replied, her eyes meeting Tom's for a fraction too long. Michael took a slow sip of his scotch, cataloging every glance, every subtle touch, every loaded phrase. His professional life had taught him that people reveal their truths in the spaces between words, in the things left unsaid. Tonight, the silences were deafening. "Speaking of chemistry," Tom said, turning to Michael with practiced casualness, "how's the quarterly review coming along? Any concerns I should know about?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Michael thought of the irregular transactions he'd discovered, the pattern of money moving through offshore accounts. "Nothing major," he replied, matching Tom's tone. "Though I did notice some interesting investment patterns we should discuss." Diana's hand tightened around her fork, a slight tremor that only someone who'd spent decades watching her would notice. Tom's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened. "We should set up a meeting next week," he said smoothly. "I've been thinking about restructuring some investments." "Dad," Emma interrupted, her voice steady despite its softness, "didn't you mention wanting to show me those old sailing photos from your first trip with the Hendersons? The ones in your study?" Michael recognized the lifeline his daughter was throwing him. "Yes, of course. Sarah, would you mind if we stepped into the study for a moment?" Sarah waved them off with a brittle smile, already reaching for the wine bottle. As they walked down the hallway, Michael noticed Diana and Tom exchanging glances, a silent conversation between conspirators. The study was a testament to decades of friendship, photos of family vacations, business celebrations, children's graduations. Emma closed the door behind them and pulled out her phone. "I've been monitoring Mom's text messages," she whispered, her hands shaking slightly. "While we were at dinner, she sent one to T. We need to move faster. He's getting suspicious." Michael stared at a photo on the wall, both couples on their shared vacation in Greece 5 years ago. Diana was leaning against Tom, his hand on her waist, while Michael had his arm around Sarah. At the time, it had seemed like a natural pose between old friends. Now, he wondered how long he'd been looking at evidence without seeing it. "There's something else," Emma continued, her voice catching. "I did some digging into those offshore accounts. They're not just receiving money from Mom's transfers. There are deposits from multiple sources, including some of your firm's biggest clients besides Tom. It's like they're building something. Something big." A soft knock at the study door made them both jump. Sarah Henderson stood in the doorway, her face pale in the dim light. "Can I come in?" she asked, closing the door quietly behind her. "There are things you need to know, Michael. Things I should have told you months ago." She sank into a leather armchair, her composure cracking. I thought I could handle it on my own, thought I could fix things without anyone getting hurt. But it's gone too far. She pulled out a USB drive from her pocket. Everything's here, the real investment records, the private email accounts, the shell companies. Tom doesn't know I found it. How long? Michael asked, his voice hoarse. The affair? 3 years, maybe 4. The financial scheme? Longer. Sarah's laugh was hollow. They thought they were so clever, using our marriages as cover while they built their little empire. Did you know they're planning to transfer everything offshore next month? Right after your anniversary trip to Tuscany. Michael felt Emma's hand slip into his, anchoring him as his world continued to unravel. In the distance, they could hear Diana's laughter floating down the hallway, followed by the clink of glasses. The sound of people celebrating while others' lives burned to ash. We have choices to make, Sarah said, her voice stronger now. All of us. They're not the only ones who can make plans. Emma straightened, her mother's text message still glowing on her phone screen. We need to move faster. Then we'll move faster, she said, her voice carrying the same determination Michael had heard in his own earlier that day. As they sat in Tom Henderson's study, surrounded by photographic evidence of decades of deception, 3 people began to plan. Outside, the Seattle rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of the life they had thought they knew, making way for something new, something built on truth rather than carefully crafted lies. The sound of approaching footsteps made them fall silent. Diana's voice called out, Michael. Emma. Tom's about to open the special wine he's been saving. You won't want to miss this. Sarah's eyes met Michael's, and he saw his own pain reflected there, but something else too, resolve. Well, she said quietly, shall we go see what other surprises they have in store for us? They stood, straightening their clothes, adjusting their expressions. Sometimes, Michael realized, the greatest act of warfare was simply smiling while you gathered your ammunition. And he had a feeling they'd just acquired quite an arsenal. The dawn found Michael sitting in his home office, watching the sun paint gold across the waters of Lake Washington. He hadn't slept. How could he, when every family photo on the walls now felt like an accusation? 25 years of memories, each one now requiring re-examination through the lens of betrayal. Emma had insisted on staying the night, claiming the guest room she'd grown up in. They'd heard Diana come home late, her heels clicking softly on the marble floors, pausing briefly outside Michael's office door before continuing to the master bedroom. Neither of them had acknowledged her presence. The USB drive Sarah had given them lay on his desk like a live grenade. After returning from the Hendersons, he and Emma had spent hours going through its contents. The scope of the deception was staggering, not just a simple affair, but a carefully orchestrated financial scheme that had been years in the making. Tom and Diana had been systematically siphoning funds from major client accounts, disguising the transactions through a complex web of shell companies. Dad? Emma's soft voice came from the doorway. She stood there in her old Stanford sweatshirt, 2 cups of coffee in hand. The morning light caught the tears she was trying to hide. I made your favorite. Extra shot of espresso. Michael managed a smile, gesturing to the leather chair beside his desk. The same chair where he'd taught her to read financial statements when she was 12, nurturing her natural curiosity about his work. Now, that shared knowledge had become a tool for unraveling their family's destruction. I've been thinking about Mom's charity work, Emma said, settling into the chair. All those fundraisers she organized, the private donations she handled, it wasn't just about social status, was it? No, Michael replied, pulling up one of Sarah's documented spreadsheets. They were using the charities to launder money. The donations would go in clean and come out dirty, mixed with legitimate funds. Your mother's social connections made her the perfect front. The perfect front, Emma repeated bitterly. Just like their marriages were the perfect front. She paused, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. Dad, have you looked at the email exchanges between them? The ones from last year? Michael shook his head. Some truths felt too heavy to face before sunrise. They were planning to leave after your anniversary trip, Emma continued, her voice breaking. New identities, new lives in a country without extradition. She swallowed hard, they even joked about how convenient it would be if you had an accident while sailing in Tuscany. The coffee cup in Michael's hand trembled slightly. He set it down before it could betray more of his emotion. The woman he'd built his life with, the mother of his children, had contemplated his death with the same casualness she used to plan dinner parties. I keep thinking about James, Emma whispered. Should we tell him? He's so focused on making partner at his firm. Not yet, Michael decided. We need to be strategic. Your mother and Tom didn't build this scheme overnight. We can't dismantle it in a day. He turned to his computer, pulling up his firm's client list. Sarah mentioned other clients being involved. We need to identify who else is part of this. Emma nodded, her analytical mind already at work. We should start with the charity boards Mom serves on. Cross-reference the donors with your client list, look for patterns in the donation amounts and timing. As they worked, the sun climbed higher, casting their shadows across the office floor. Diana's voice floated up from the kitchen below, humming as she made breakfast, the same tune she'd hummed every morning for as long as Michael could remember. The normalcy of it felt obscene. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah, Tom's calling an emergency board meeting for Monday. Says he wants to discuss restructuring the investment strategies for our major accounts. We need to move fast. Dad? Emma's voice pulled him back. She was holding a photograph she'd found tucked inside one of Diana's charity folders. It showed Tom and Diana on a beach he didn't recognize, looking at each other with undisguised affection. The timestamp showed it was taken 3 years ago, during a week when Diana had supposedly been at a charity conference in Vancouver. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made them both freeze. Diana's voice called out, Michael. Emma. I'm making pancakes. Your favorite recipe, Emmy. Emma's hand found his across the desk, squeezing tight. The gesture reminded him of when she was small, seeking comfort during thunderstorms. But this storm had been brewing for years, gathering strength while they slept in false security. Coming, Mom, Emma called back, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. She turned to Michael, her expression hardening. We need to play along for now, right? Keep them thinking they're in control. Michael nodded, standing to straighten his tie. Sometimes the best defense is letting your opponent think they've already won. He tucked Sarah's USB drive into his pocket and squared his shoulders. Shall we go have pancakes with the woman who's planning my tragic sailing accident? As they descended the stairs, Michael felt a strange calm settle over him. He had spent his career understanding risk management and strategic planning. Now, those skills would serve a different purpose. Diana might have taught him about betrayal, but she was about to learn about consequences. In the kitchen, Diana stood at the stove, still humming her morning tune. The sunlight caught her wedding ring as she flipped a pancake, sending prismatic reflections dancing across the walls. Such a pretty show of lights, Michael thought, just like their marriage, all sparkle and illusion, disguising the darkness beneath. Saturday morning found Michael in his downtown office, the gentle hum of weekend silence broken only by the soft clicking of computer keys. Emma sat cross-legged on his office couch, surrounded by financial documents, her father's determination etched in the set of her jaw. They'd left Diana at home, planning the upcoming Tuscany trip with an enthusiasm that now felt predatory. Look at this, Dad, Emma said, holding up a document. Mom's charity, Women Supporting Women. Their biggest donations always came 2 days after Tom's largest client withdrawals. The amounts match if you add up the smaller transfers. Michael nodded, feeling a complex mix of pride in his daughter's sharp mind and grief that she had to use it this way. They used the charity's reputation to avoid scrutiny. Who would question donations to a women's empowerment organization? The irony wasn't lost on either of them. A soft knock interrupted their work. Sarah Henderson stood in the doorway, looking elegant but exhausted in a charcoal gray suit. "Tom's at his golf club," she said, closing the door behind her. "I have about 3 hours before he starts wondering where I am." She placed a stack of papers on Michael's desk. "These are from his private safe. Bank statements, offshore account details, everything." Her hands trembled slightly. "He's been different lately. Aggressive. When I questioned a large withdrawal last week, She touched her wrist unconsciously, where a fading bruise peeked out from under her sleeve. Michael's stomach clenched. He'd known Tom for 30 years, trusted him with his business, his friendship, his family. How many signs had he missed while maintaining his picture-perfect worldview? Emma moved to Sarah's side, gently guiding her to the couch. "When did it start?" she asked softly, her psychology training evident in her careful tone. "The controlling behavior?" "Years ago. Small things at first, questioning my purchases, monitoring my phone calls, suggesting I cut ties with friends who didn't understand our lifestyle." Sarah's laugh was hollow. "The physical stuff is new. I think the pressure's getting to him. Monday's board meeting, he's planning something big." Michael turned to his computer, pulling up the emergency protocols he'd spent the night developing. "I've been going through our major client accounts. The patterns suggest they've compromised at least 30% of our total holdings. But they need board approval to move anything over 10 million. "The Tuscany trip," Emma interjected. "They're planning to push it through while you're away." Sarah nodded. "Tom's already lined up support from 3 board members. He's been whining and dining them for months, probably promising them a cut." Michael stood, walking to the windows. Seattle's skyline stretched before him, the same view he'd had when Emma first brought him news of Diana's betrayal. Was that only days ago? It felt like years. "Dad?" Emma's voice was hesitant. "I've been thinking about Mom's phone calls. The ones she makes every Tuesday from that coffee shop downtown." Michael turned, recognizing the look in his daughter's eyes, the same one she'd had as a child when solving complex puzzles. "What about them?" "The coffee shop is next to Western Union. I checked her credit card statements, she always makes a transfer right after those calls. Small amounts, but consistent. What if?" Emma paused, glancing at Sarah. "What if they're paying someone? Someone who could help with their plans for your accident in Tuscany?" The room fell silent. Michael remembered Diana's insistence on the sailing portion of their anniversary trip, her casual mention of the isolated coves they could explore, just the two of them. Sarah's phone chimed, a text from Tom asking where she was. The sound seemed to break something in her. "I should have told you sooner," she whispered. "When I first found the documents, when I first suspected, but I was scared. Tom has connections everywhere. The police, the banks, even some judges. He made sure I knew that." Michael moved to her side, his protective instincts rising. "You're telling us now. That's what matters." He looked between Sarah and Emma, these 2 women who had become his unexpected allies in this storm of betrayal. "We have until Monday's board meeting to get everything in place. Tom and Diana think they're the only ones who can play the long game, but they're wrong." Emma stood, gathering the scattered documents with renewed purpose. "I'll start digitizing everything. We need multiple copies, stored securely." She turned to Sarah. "Can you get back into Tom's safe? We need the most recent transaction records." Sarah straightened, something of her old strength returning. "He'll be at golf until 4. I can get what we need." She paused, touching the bruise on her wrist. "Just, just promise me one thing, Michael. When this all comes out, when they realize we know, promise me you won't let him hurt anyone else." Michael thought of the decades of friendship, the shared vacations, the business built on trust. Then he thought of Sarah's bruised wrist, Diana's secret phone calls, the calculated plans for his own demise. "I promise," he said, his voice hard. "By the time we're done, Tom Henderson won't be in a position to hurt anyone ever again." As Sarah left to return to her gilded cage and Emma immersed herself in document scanning, Michael received a text from Diana, "Packed your blue tie for Tuscany. The one from Christmas. It'll be perfect for our sunset sail." He stared at the message, remembering how she'd helped Tom pick out that tie. Had they been laughing about it even then, planning his final voyage? The thought settled in his chest like ice, but alongside it grew something else, a cold, clear purpose. Monday's board meeting wouldn't go quite as Tom and Diana planned. Sometimes the most devastating storms were the ones you never saw coming. Sunday evening cast long shadows through Michael's home office as he listened to Sarah's voice trembling over the speakerphone. Emma sat beside him, her hand covering his in silent support. "He knows something's wrong," Sarah whispered. "He spent all afternoon in his study, making calls. I heard him mention Tuscany." A pause, filled with unsteady breathing. "He destroyed his phone when I walked past the door. Just smashed it. Then he smiled at me like nothing happened." Michael exchanged glances with Emma, seeing his own concern mirrored in her eyes. "Sarah, I want you to listen carefully," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Pack a bag. Nothing obvious, just essentials in your workout tote. Emma will pick you up for your regular Monday morning yoga class. He checks the security cameras." Sarah's voice was barely audible. "He'll know if I leave with more than usual." "Mom's coming," Emma interrupted, looking at her phone. "She just turned onto our street." Michael quickly ended the call, his mind racing. Diana had been growing increasingly watchful over the weekend, her usual grace giving way to sharp glances and pointed questions about his late nights at the office. The sound of heels on hardwood announced Diana's arrival. She appeared in the doorway, elegant in a black dress, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Working on a Sunday? That's not like you, Michael." Her gaze slid to Emma. "And you, sweetheart? Don't you have classes to prepare for?" "Just helping Dad with some research," Emma replied, her voice remarkably steady. "This morning's charity brunch got me thinking about investment strategies for nonprofits." Diana's smile flickered. "How lovely. Though I worry you're both working too hard. Especially you, Michael. We wouldn't want you too exhausted for our anniversary trip." The way she emphasized "exhausted" made Michael's skin crawl. He thought of the sailing route she'd planned, the isolated coves, the statistics on Mediterranean boating accidents he'd found in Tom's private files. "Actually," Emma stood, gathering her papers, "I should head home. Early morning tomorrow, I'm meeting Sarah Henderson for yoga." Diana's perfectly manicured fingers tightened on her purse strap. "Sarah's doing yoga now? Tom mentioned she's been unstable lately. Emotional. He's quite concerned about her state of mind." The casual cruelty in Diana's voice, the way she participated in undermining a woman she'd called friend for decades, struck Michael like a physical blow. How had he missed this side of her for so long? "Mom," Emma's voice carried a edge she'd never used with Diana before, "people in pain aren't unstable. They're human." Diana's face hardened for a moment before smoothing into practiced concern. "Of course, darling. I only meant we should be supportive." Speaking of support, she turned to Michael. "Tom called. He wants to meet early tomorrow, before the board meeting. Something about finalizing the restructuring proposals." "I'll be there," Michael replied, thinking of the documents hidden in his office safe, the recordings Emma had managed to secure, the evidence they'd spent the weekend compiling. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." After Diana left to freshen up before dinner, Emma collapsed onto the couch. "How did we not see it?" she whispered. "All these years, the way they worked together to isolate Sarah, to manipulate everyone around them." Michael moved to sit beside his daughter, feeling the weight of his own blindness. Sometimes the hardest things to see are the ones right in front of us. But Sarah saw the truth, and she found the courage to share it. Now we have to make sure her courage wasn't wasted. Emma leaned against his shoulder, the way she had as a child after nightmares. "I've been thinking about all those charity events Mom hosted, the way she'd showcase Sarah's episodes to the bored wives. Making her look unreliable, unstable." She straightened suddenly. "Dad, what if that wasn't just cruelty? What if they were laying groundwork?" Michael's mind raced through the implications. If Sarah ever threatened to expose them, everyone would dismiss her as emotionally unstable, Emma finished. "Just like they're trying to do now." The sound of Diana's heels returning made them fall silent. But Michael's mind was already formulating new additions to tomorrow's plan. Tom and Diana had spent years crafting their narrative, using wealth and social status to silence their victims. Tomorrow, different voices would finally be heard. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "He's drinking a lot. Keeps talking about tomorrow's meeting, about taking care of loose ends. Please don't let him hurt anyone else." Emma read the message over his shoulder, her face setting with determination. "We should move tonight," she said quietly. "The yoga class might be too late." Michael nodded, already dialing a number he'd hoped he wouldn't need until tomorrow. "Change of plans," he said when the line connected. "We need the security team in place tonight. And Sarah Henderson needs an immediate extraction. Yes, full documentation of any interference or threats. And make sure the safe house is ready." As he ended the call, Diana's voice floated up from the kitchen, humming that same morning tune. But tonight, its familiar notes carried a different message, not of domestic comfort, but of time running out. "Emmy," he said softly, using his old nickname for his daughter. "Tonight's going to be difficult. Are you sure you want to be involved in this part?" Emma's answer was to pull up the security firm's number on her own phone. "Sarah needs all the allies she can get right now. And so do you." She paused, her voice catching. "Besides, Mom stopped being just my mother the moment she decided to help plan your death." Through the gathering darkness, father and daughter began making calls, setting in motion the events that would shatter the careful facades of power and respectability that Tom and Diana had built. Sometimes, Michael realized, true strength lay not in maintaining appearances, but in being brave enough to break them. The first light of dawn was breaking over Seattle when Michael arrived at his firm's offices. The security team had moved Sarah to a safe house just after midnight, documenting Tom's explosive reaction when he discovered her absence. Each piece of evidence, his threats, his attempts to breach the security perimeter, his increasingly erratic calls, had been carefully logged, building an irrefutable record of the man behind the polished facade. Emma had stayed with Sarah through the night, her psychology training and deep empathy providing a steady anchor as years of suppressed trauma finally found voice. Now she sat beside Michael in the conference room, both of them watching the early morning light paint shadows across the mahogany table where so many deals had been sealed with handshakes and false smiles. "Mr. Harrison." His assistant's voice was soft but urgent through the intercom. "They're here." Diana entered first, her usual grace somehow brittle in the morning light. Tom followed, his confident stride masking the tension evident in his clenched jaw. Behind them came the board members, their faces a mix of confusion and concern at the unusual hour. "Before we begin," Tom announced, reaching for the portfolio he always carried, "I have some concerns about irregular activities I've noticed in certain accounts." "Actually, Tom," Michael interrupted, his voice steady, "I'd like to start with a different kind of irregularity." He pressed a button on his laptop, and Sarah's voice filled the room through the speakers, clear, strong, and unafraid. I'm making this recording because I need there to be a record of the manipulation, the isolation, the careful way they dismantled everything I was, piece by piece, while making the world see them as pillars of the community. Diana's perfectly composed face cracked. This is ridiculous. Sarah's been unstable for years. Everyone knows. Everyone knows what you wanted them to know, Emma cut in, her voice gentle but firm. She began distributing folders to each board member. These are the documented strategies used to discredit Sarah while systematically embezzling from client accounts. The gaslighting. The orchestrated social isolation. The careful construction of a narrative that painted her as unstable while they built their offshore empire. Michael watched his wife's face as the scope of their documentation became clear. The numbered accounts. The charity fraud. The carefully planned accident awaiting him in Tuscany. With each revelation, the mask of sophistication crumbled further, revealing the stranger beneath. Tom surged to his feet, his carefully cultivated charm giving way to raw fury. You have no idea what you're doing. The people I know, the connections, are all documented here, Michael finished, sliding another set of files across the table. Including the judges you bribed, the officers you paid off, and the witnesses you intimidated. Sarah kept meticulous records, Tom. Even when you thought you'd broken her spirit, she was gathering evidence. That's the thing about truly strong people, they find ways to survive, to fight back, even when the world is designed to silence them. The boardroom fell silent as the weight of the evidence settled over everyone. Diana's hand trembled as she reached for the files, her eyes widening as she recognized her own correspondence, her own careful plans laid bare. The police are already involved, Emma added softly. Not your usual contacts, Mom. Different departments, different jurisdictions. Sarah's testimony is being recorded as we speak, along with evidence from other victims who've come forward since last night. It turns out when one person finds the courage to speak, others find their voice too. Tom's face contorted with rage. He lunged toward Michael, but security personnel materialized from the shadows, their presence a reminder that the old power dynamics had shifted irrevocably. As Tom and Diana were led away, their protests echoing down the corridors of the firm they'd tried to destroy, Michael felt a complex wave of emotions wash over him. Grief for the years of friendship that had been a lie. Anger at the calculated cruelty. But mostly, a profound appreciation for the authentic bonds that had emerged from the wreckage. Emma moved to stand beside him at the window, their reflection ghostly in the glass. Below, police cars were arriving, their lights painting the morning in blue and red. I keep thinking about what Sarah said last night, Emma murmured. About how the hardest part wasn't the big moments of abuse, but the small daily erosions of self. The way they made her doubt her own reality. Michael nodded, thinking of his own journey from blindness to clarity. Sometimes the greatest act of love is simply believing someone's truth. Standing witness to their pain without trying to minimize it or explain it away. The board members filed out, their faces grim with the responsibility of what they'd learned. Michael's assistant appeared with a fresh pot of coffee and a reminder of the day's modified schedule, client notifications, press statements, the careful work of rebuilding trust. Dad? Emma's voice was hesitant. When Sarah talked about starting over, about reclaiming her life, she said something that stuck with me. That healing isn't about forgetting the past, but about choosing how it shapes your future. Michael thought about the Tuscany tickets on his desk, the anniversary plans that had been meant to be his last. Your mother and Tom tried to write an ending to our story, he said quietly. But they forgot that every ending is also a beginning. We just have to be brave enough to turn the page. As the sun climbed higher over Seattle, father and daughter began the practical work of reconstruction. There would be hard days ahead, legal battles, public scrutiny, the complex process of healing from betrayal. But they would face it together, their bonds strengthened by the very storm that was meant to break them. In the safe house across town, Sarah was finally sleeping, watched over by a security team and supported by a network of survivors and advocates. Her journey of recovery was just beginning, but she would not walk it alone. Sometimes, Michael reflected, it takes breaking apart to discover who will help you rebuild. The morning light caught the edges of the shattered family photographs on his desk, transforming them from accusations into artifacts of a past that could no longer hurt them. In their place would come new memories, new bonds, new definitions of family built not on obligation or appearance, but on choice, courage, and unconditional support. It wasn't the ending any of them had expected, but perhaps it was the beginning they all needed, a chance to build something authentic from the ashes of beautiful lies.